In August 1944, at Camp Concordia in Kansas, a group of German women auxiliary prisoners, after weeks of assisting local farmers with the harvest, are served freshly grilled ears of sweet corn in the mess hall. Accustomed to viewing corn as mere animal feed, one exclaims, "Schweinefutter," pig food. Amused, the American G.I.s encourage them to take a bite. The eldest prisoner hesitantly tries it, and the unexpected sweetness surprises her. Soon, the initial skepticism turns into eager requests for more. That evening, the women reflect on this simple yet profound experience, realizing that America might offer more than just fences and guards. It holds small pleasures capable of transforming perspectives with a single buttery bite. The August sun beat down on Camp Concordia, Kansas, a relentless, unforgiving hammer pounding the flat, endless plains into submission. The air hung thick and heavy, a humid blanket that clung to skin and stole breath, carrying with it the persistent, monotonous symphony of cicadas. Their ceaseless thrumming was the soundtrack to the German women's captivity, an ever-present reminder of the alien landscape that stretched for miles in every direction, so starkly different from the rolling, familiar hills and ancient forests of their homeland. Dust, fine and red, coated everything. Their worn uniforms, the rough barracks, the very sweat that streamed down their faces as they toiled in the fields. Week after week they had risen before dawn, marched out to assist local farmers, their hands calloused and blistered by the unfamiliar labor of the harvest. Today it was the corn, towering stalks that scraped against their arms, the ripe ears bursting with yellow kernels. It was back-breaking work, the sun glinting off the GI's rifles, a constant dull ache settling deep into their bones. Each movement was a testament to sheer endurance, a quiet act of defiance against the crushing monotony and the indignity of their situation. Among them was Elsa Schmidt, her face etched with the weariness of 45 years, but her posture still commanding a quiet respect. Before the war, Elsa had been a school teacher in a small village nestled in the Black Forest. Her days were filled with the gentle rhythm of children's laughter, the rustle of turning pages, and the scent of chalk dust. Her husband, Carl, a quiet watchmaker, had crafted intricate pieces that marked the passage of time with elegant precision. Their two children, Liesel and Franz, were the center of her world. When the war began, first slowly, then with an accelerating, terrifying momentum, Elsa had resisted, clinging to the innocence of her classroom. But as the men were conscripted and the needs of the war machine grew, she, like so many others, felt the relentless pressure to contribute. She joined the Wehrmacht auxiliaries not out of ardent ideological fervor, but out of a desperate, patriotic duty to protect her family, to ensure their survival, to do her part for the Heimat. She had hoped her service would bring her closer to Carl, who was somewhere on the Eastern Front, a place that now felt like a mythical, deadly land. But instead, she found herself swept away, further and further from home until her world dissolved into the chaotic retreat, the eventual capture, and the jarring reality of this Kansas farm. Every day in the fields, the phantom weight of her children's hands in hers was a torment, a silent grief she carried beneath her stoic exterior. She moved with a purpose, her hands mechanically snapping corn from stalks, her gaze distant, filled with unspoken thoughts of a life irrevocably altered. She was the unofficial matriarch of their small, tight-knit group of auxiliary personnel from the Wehrmacht, captured along with the combat troops, now reduced to farm laborers. The younger women looked to her for strength, for guidance, for the unspoken reassurance that their spirit, though bruised, was not broken. Elsa carried that burden with stoicism, her jaw often set, her eyes rarely betraying the depth of her resolve. Beside her, Greta Muller, barely 22, worked with a furious, jerky energy, her movements fueled by a simmering resentment that was as much a part of her as her sharp, angular features. Her cynicism was a thick, almost impenetrable armor, forged in the fires of personal loss and widespread disillusionment. Before the war, Greta had been engaged to a promising young engineer, a man named Eric who had filled her life with laughter and ambitious plans for a future that now seemed impossibly naive. He had been a fervent believer in the new order, full of its promises of a glorious Germany. When he was conscripted, he left her with a ring and a heart full of hope. His last letter, stained with grime and smelling of gunpowder, spoke of the harshness of the Russian winter, the futility of it all. Then silence. A terse official notification followed, cold and impersonal, a casualty among millions. Greta's youthful idealism shattered, replaced by a bitter cynicism towards all authority, all promises, all grand narratives. She joined the auxiliaries out of a sense of grim fatalism, seeing it as a path to an inevitable end, not a cause. She was quick to sneer, quicker to voice her displeasure, her cynicism a sharp shield against their bleak reality. For Greta, everything American was an insult, a symbol of their defeat and the vulgarity of the enemy. She'd occasionally mutter under her breath, a stream of German epithets that the G.I.s, thankfully, didn't understand, but which resonated with the shared frustration of her compatriots. Many times she would cast glances at the young American soldiers. Her eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of weakness or, worse, pity. Both were equally unacceptable. Her youth, instead of offering hope, seemed to trap her further in bitterness, a burning flame that isolated her from the resigned quietude of some of the others. Hannah Richter, younger still, perhaps 19 or 20, was quieter. Her dark eyes, framed by stray strands of hair that escaped her kerchief, absorbed everything. Before the war, Hannah had lived a sheltered life, a farmer's daughter from Saxony, her days marked by the rhythms of the seasons and the simple joys of a close-knit family. She had dreamed of becoming a seamstress, her fingers already adept at embroidery, envisioning beautiful gowns and intricate patterns. The war had snatched her away from the quiet beauty of her village, propelling her into a world of uniforms and distant battlefields she could barely comprehend. She was less politically charged than Greta, less burdened by the weight of leadership than Elsa. Her joining the auxiliaries was a matter of circumstance and collective mobilization, not a deep-seated conviction. Hannah possessed a nascent curiosity, a spark of openness that the war had not entirely extinguished, though she kept it well hidden under the collective shroud of German pride and prisoner solidarity. She was fiercely loyal to Elsa and Greta, drawing strength from their shared bond, but there was a part of her that observed, that wondered, that occasionally dared to imagine a world beyond the barbed wire and the uniforms. Sometimes her eyes would rest on the G.I.s, not with outright disdain or aggressive challenge, but with a kind of perplexity, as if trying to decipher the enigmas of these unfamiliar people, these enemies who were also, undeniably, just men performing their duties. The language barrier was an additional layer of isolation, making the Americans seem even more distant, more alien, yet a part of her yearned for understanding, for a glimpse behind the uniforms and the rifles. Their days were a repetitive cycle of labor and confinement, punctuated only by the meager, bland rations provided by their captors. The barracks themselves were stark, rows of cots separated by thin blankets, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and lingering despair. The sanitation facilities were rudimentary, adding to the daily humiliations. Despite the constant discomfort, they clung to small routines, tiny acts of defiance against the stripping of their identity. They braided each other's hair, shared whispered memories of home, and above all spoke only German, a linguistic fortress against the encroaching English. In their hearts, they carried a deep-seated belief in their cultural superiority, especially when it came to cuisine. American food, when they encountered it, seemed unsophisticated, bland, or strangely sweet, an affront to their refined European palates. They often whispered among themselves in the barracks about the proper way to cook a sauerbraten, the delicate spices of a Lebkuchen, or the hearty richness of a Bauernbrot. These memories were not just about food. They were about home, about identity, about a world of order and tradition that America, with its raw, sprawling expanse and its utilitarian approach to sustenance, seemed utterly incapable of comprehending. The food of their captors felt like another invisible wall, a subtle but constant reminder of their diminished status, of how far they had fallen from a world of cultured meals to the stark, uninspired fare of a prisoner of war camp. They clung to these cultural distinctions, these small, perceived superiorities, as a way to maintain a shred of dignity, a quiet act of mental resistance against the overwhelming reality of their defeat and incarceration. To them, food was not just sustenance. It was culture, history, art, and its absence or substitution with something lesser was a constant gnawing punishment. The mere idea of accepting the enemy's food was, to many, a small sacrilege, a further erosion of the self they desperately tried to preserve. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, the shrill whistle signaling the end of the workday finally cut through the air. A collective sigh, almost imperceptible but deeply felt, rippled through the ranks of the women. Their bodies screamed for rest. Their minds yearned for the brief respite that evening offered, however illusory it might be behind the wire fences. The march back to Camp Concordia was a familiar, weary procession, the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the dusty path, a dull counterpoint to their exhaustion. The guards, impassive figures at the perimeter, watched them return, their faces shadowed by the brim of their helmets. It was a daily ritual, devoid of overt emotion for both sides, a simple fulfillment of duties that had become rote and mechanical. The mess hall, a long utilitarian wooden structure, was their destination. It was not a place of comfort or camaraderie, but merely a necessity, a functional space designed for efficient feeding. Inside, the air was hot and close, smelling of institutional cooking and unwashed bodies. Long wooden tables and benches filled the room, stark and uninviting, a constant tangible reminder of their captivity. Each meal was a ritual of routine, a silent agreement between captors and captured, sustenance provided, sustenance consumed, with neither pleasure nor protest. Anticipation was rarely of delight, for the food was usually bland, a repetitive offering of stews and hardtack that did little to nourish the spirit. The wait for food was long, hunger a constant companion, but any hope for enjoyment had long since withered. Sergeant Ben Carter, a man in his late 20s or early 30s, stood near the serving line, his hands resting on his belt. Before the war, he'd been a quiet farmer from Iowa, familiar with the rhythms of the land and the simple goodness of a home-cooked meal. He wasn't a cruel man, merely a soldier tasked with a job, and he approached it with a quiet efficiency that bordered on kindness. He observed the women as they shuffled in, their faces tired, their eyes downcast. He saw them not as enemies but as human beings caught in the harsh machinery of war, a machine he was also a part of. He recognized the weariness in their posture, the same fatigue he saw in the faces of his own men after a long day. Today, he felt a flicker of something different, a slight pride, perhaps, or a simple satisfaction. He'd helped arrange a little something special for dinner, a taste of home for his own men, but also, he hoped, a small gesture of relief for the prisoners. He saw the piles of freshly grilled corn as a treat, a welcome change from the usual stew or canned meat, a familiar comfort for a summer evening. He was oblivious, however, to the vast cultural chasm that this particular foodstuff represented. He just wanted to see a bit of normalcy, a rare moment of sharing in a fractured world. Then came the moment. The G.I.s, with a flourish that seemed almost celebratory in its stark contrast to the women's grim mood, began to bring out large, steaming platters. Piled high on them were vibrant golden ears of corn, freshly pulled from the grill, glistening with butter, their kernels plump and inviting. The sight was undeniably striking, a splash of cheerful yellow against the drab backdrop of the mess hall. The aroma, sweet and earthy, mingled with the faint scent of charcoal wafting through the stale air. It was a smell that, to an American, evoked summer evenings, barbecues, and simple, wholesome joy. To the German women, it was utterly foreign and deeply unsettling. A ripple of confusion, then a collective murmur spread through the German women. They stared at the peculiar yellow cobs, their expressions a mixture of bewilderment and vague distaste. It didn't look like any vegetable they consumed. Its very appearance screamed unfamiliar and wrong for human food. They had seen it growing in the fields, had even harvested it, but had always assumed it was destined for livestock. In Germany, maize, or mais, was indeed primarily used for animal fodder, a coarse peasant crop, certainly not for the dinner table. To offer it to them, to people, was almost an insult, a degradation. Its vibrant color seemed aggressively cheerful, almost mocking their somber mood. The kernels, bursting with moisture, were alarmingly large, nothing like the delicate vegetables they prized. It was barbaric, they thought, to present such a thing as a meal. It reinforced every negative stereotype they held about American unsophistication. Greta, her youthful cynicism always at the ready, was the first to break the tense silence. Unable to contain her utter disdain for this perceived barbarity, She flung out her hand, pointed dramatically at the steaming piles, and declared in a voice loud enough to carry through the mess hall, her words dripping with contempt, "Schweinefutter, pig food." Her voice, usually sharp, now held a note of genuine disgust, an affront to her very being. "They truly believe us to be animals, Elsa, to offer us this slop," she hissed in German to Elsa, who stood beside her rigid with restrained fury. The word hung in the air, sharp and clear, cutting through the low hum of the mess hall. A few other women echoed her sentiment, a low grumble of agreement, a shared sense of disgust. "Ja, Schweinefutter," one murmured, shaking her head. Another snorted, a small, choked laugh of disbelief. The sentiment was clear. This was an insult, a further humiliation piled upon their already burdened shoulders. It reinforced every preconceived notion they held about American culinary inferiority. This was not food for people, for Europeans, but a coarse feed, barely fit for the lowest of creatures. It was a blatant disregard for their basic human dignity, a further reminder of their abject position. The cultural divide, unbridgeable and deep, had just manifested itself in a pile of golden corn. This was not a minor culinary faux pas. It was an active dismissal of their entire cultural framework. They were being offered what amounted to a slap in the face, a clear message that their captors saw them as no better than animals. The G.I.s, who had been smiling expectantly, were momentarily taken aback by Greta's sharp, guttural exclamation. "Schweinefutter," Sergeant Carter repeated, his brow furrowed in confusion, catching only the tone, not the meaning. Private Miller, who had served briefly in Germany before the war and knew a smattering of German phrases, stepped forward. "She says it's pig food, Sarge," Miller explained, a slight smirk playing on his lips, though he quickly stifled it under Sergeant Carter's stern gaze. "They don't eat corn, not like this. It's for livestock over there." Miller found the situation rather comical, a classic example of the oddities of foreign cultures. Sergeant Carter's expression shifted from confusion to a mixture of amusement and a touch of paternalistic exasperation. He hadn't intended to insult them. In his mind, he was offering a rare seasonal treat, a taste of America's bounty. He knew the corn was good, sweet, and fresh from the fields they'd just helped harvest. This was simply a cultural misunderstanding, one he felt could be easily remedied with a simple taste. They just needed to try it, he thought, to understand. He had seen plenty of strange customs on his tour of duty, but a refusal of fresh, sweet corn, that was a new one, and a baffling one to a man raised on its deliciousness. He stepped forward, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "No, no, ladies," he said, his voice calm and reassuring, though he knew they wouldn't understand the words. His tone, however, was universally understood as non-threatening, almost inviting. He gestured towards the corn, then to his mouth, trying to convey delicious and eat, with an exaggerated mime. He then turned to his men, a grin spreading across his face. "All right, boys, show 'em how it's done. Butter and salt. Lots of butter." A few of the G.I.s moved to a side table where large tubs of melting butter and shakers of coarse salt awaited. They picked up the hot ears of corn, their fingers protected by cloth, slathered them liberally with the golden liquid, the steam rising in fragrant tendrils, and sprinkled them with salt. The rich, sweet aroma of cooked corn, butter, and salt began to fill the mess hall, a subtly enticing scent that managed to penetrate the general air of resentment and fatigue. It was a smell that spoke of warmth, of harvest, of simple, earthy pleasure, a scent that, for a fleeting moment, even some of the German women found their stomachs rumbling too, despite their minds' protestations. The G.I.s ate with obvious enjoyment, their faces relaxed, their conversation light, completely oblivious to the cultural offense they had just caused. This display, intended to entice, only deepened the women's resolve. The German women, however, remained rigid, a wall of silent, collective refusal. Their arms were crossed, their expressions resolute, their eyes fixed on the G.I.s with a mix of defiance and suspicion. For them, accepting this pig food was not just a culinary matter. It was a surrender of pride, a tacit admission that their captor's way was acceptable, perhaps even good. To yield to the offering felt like a betrayal of their own cultural identity, of the Germany they carried in their hearts. It was a small, symbolic stand against the overwhelming power of their captors, a way to cling to their sense of self in a world that sought to strip it away. Elsa felt the weight of every gaze in the room. The younger women, Greta especially, watched her, their silent expectations a heavy mantle. To break rank, to step forward and accept this strange offering, would be to appear weak, to acknowledge a need for the enemy's sustenance, and perhaps even their humanity, which felt like a profound compromise of their principles. It was a constant, gnawing conflict within her, a battle between the deep-seated pride of her heritage and the stark, immediate needs of survival. Yet a part of her, the pragmatic part that had always overseen the well-being of those under her charge, registered the gnawing hunger in her stomach, the sheer physical exhaustion of the day. The aroma, though unsettling, was also strangely comforting, familiar in its warmth and richness even if the source was alien. And then there was the smell. It was undeniably appealing, even if her mind still recoiled from the source. It was rich, buttery, and slightly smoky, an unfamiliar fragrance that nonetheless stirred a forgotten hunger deep within her. It reminded her, strangely, of the roasted chestnuts sold by street vendors in Berlin during winter, a distant memory of comfort and warmth. The G.I.s continued to eat their corn with relish, their chewing loud, their faces relaxed in enjoyment. Their persistent, good-natured insistence, devoid of malice or coercion, added another layer of subtle, almost insidious pressure. It wasn't a direct command, but an invitation, subtly undermining her resolve, challenging her to reconsider. Perhaps, she thought, it was not an insult but merely ignorance. Or worse, what if it was a genuine gesture? What if, despite everything, these people were not entirely devoid of common decency? The thought was unsettling, conflicting with all she had been taught to believe about the enemy. Greta, ever vigilant, noticed a fleeting flicker of something in Hannah's eyes, a slight widening as the aroma reached them. She quickly nudged Hannah, a sharp, almost imperceptible movement that pulled the younger woman back, reinforcing their shared stance. Their refusal was a small victory, a way to reclaim a sliver of control in a world where they had none. They would not break, not for Schweinefutter. They had survived much worse than bland rations. They would not be swayed by a strange, yellow vegetable. "Don't even think about it," Greta whispered fiercely to Hannah in German, her eyes darting between the corn and the guards. It is a trick, a humiliation, but Elsa was tired of small victories born of stubbornness. She was tired of the constant internal battle. She looked at the G.I.s, at their open faces, at the ease with which they devoured the corn. She looked at her own women, their proud but drawn faces, their hunger palpable beneath the veneer of defiance. A silent calculation passed through her mind. What was the true cost of this refusal? More hunger? More needless antagonism? Or was there, just perhaps, something more to this foreign ritual? The kindness in Sergeant Carter's eyes, fleeting but present, gnawed at her. She thought of her own children, of the simple pleasures she longed to share with them again, of Liesel, who adored sweet treats, and Franz, always curious about new things. Pride, she realized, could be a cold comfort in an empty stomach. A leader, she knew, must sometimes make difficult, unpopular choices for the greater good, even if that good was simply a temporary alleviation of hunger and an unspoken acknowledgement of a small, momentary peace. It was a tactical decision, she told herself, a means to an end, not a capitulation. She took a deep breath, the decision hardening within her. With a deep, almost imperceptible breath, Elsa made her decision. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, but there was no defiance in her gaze, only a quiet resolve. She broke the rigid line of her compatriots, her steps measured and deliberate. The sound of her boots on the wooden floor echoed slightly in the hushed mess hall as all eyes, both American and German, turned to her. Greta gasped, a sharp, audible intake of breath, her face paling in disbelief. Hannah's eyes, however, widened with a mix of trepidation and a flicker of understanding. Elsa ignored them all, her focus solely on the task at hand. She walked towards the serving table where Sergeant Carter stood, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He picked up an ear of corn, generously buttered and salted, and extended it to her. His gaze was expectant but not mocking, a silent challenge. Elsa reached out, her fingers, still calloused from the fields, tentatively closing around the warm cob. The heat seeped into her palm, a comforting sensation that momentarily thawed the icy shell of her resolve. For a moment, she simply held it, studying the golden kernels, so alien yet so vivid. The weight of the moment hung heavy, a fragile truce between two worlds, a silent question mark hanging in the air. This was more than just food. It was a symbol, a challenge, a potential bridge or a further chasm. She imagined the disapproval on her husband Carl's face, the scorn in Greta's eyes, but pushed the thoughts aside. Her hunger, and a deeper, almost philosophical curiosity, propelled her forward. All eyes in the mess hall were fixed on Elsa. Greta watched, her initial horror slowly morphing into a morbid fascination, a silent question in her narrowed eyes. What is she doing? Her lips were pressed into a thin, white line, a betrayal of her inner turmoil, a silent accusation. Hannah, however, no longer held in check by Greta's disapproval, leaned forward slightly, her own curiosity a palpable tremor in the air, her dark eyes wide and fixed on Elsa. The other German women held their breath, a silent, collective anticipation. Had their resolute leader finally broken? Or was this another, more subtle act of defiance, a strategy she had not yet revealed? The tension was almost unbearable, a tangible force in the stuffy mess hall. The G.I.s too watched with bated breath, their casual smiles having faded, sensing the gravity of the moment. Realizing this was more than just a meal, Elsa raised the ear of corn to her mouth. It felt strange, coarse yet inviting. She took a small, tentative bite, just barely piercing the skin of a few kernels. The unfamiliar texture was surprisingly yielding, not tough or fibrous as she had expected. It was soft, almost tender, a completely unexpected sensation. The raw, primal experience bypassed all her preconceptions, all her cultural training. Then the taste. It hit her like a sudden, unexpected revelation. A burst of sweetness, intense and pure, flooded her mouth. The flavor was nothing like the savory, hearty vegetables of her homeland, nor the blandness of their usual camp rations. This was a startling, vibrant sweetness, almost like a fruit, yet with an earthy depth she couldn't quite place. And then, the crunch. A delicate, satisfying pop as the sugar-laden juice of the kernels erupted on her tongue. It was an entirely new experience, a sensory explosion that momentarily obliterated the gray monotony of her existence. The taste was immediately enhanced by the rich, creamy butter and the sharp, clean salt, a perfect counterpoint that elevated the simple flavor into something extraordinary. The combination was a symphony of unexpected delights, a stark contrast to the grim, monotonous existence she had endured for so long. It was not merely good, it was extraordinary. A wave of warmth, of pure, unadulterated pleasure washed over her, a sensation so foreign, so desperately needed in this desolate landscape. For a fleeting instant, the war, the fences, the guards, her lost family, all faded away, leaving only the pure, unadulterated sensation of taste. Elsa's stern, weary face, a mask of grim determination for so many months, softened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, which had held so much sorrow and defiance, widened slightly, a look of pure, unadulterated surprise washing over them, swiftly followed by a dawning pleasure that smoothed the hard lines around her mouth. Her lips, which had been set in a thin line, parted slightly as she took another, larger bite, drawn in by the sheer novelty and deliciousness of the experience. She chewed slowly, savoring each kernel, her gaze still distant, but now infused with a profound sense of wonder, a quiet astonishment at this unexpected gift. The world narrowed to this single golden cob, this simple, perfect moment. A small, involuntary sound, almost a hum, escaped her throat. She finished the second bite, a small, involuntary sigh escaping her lips. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded her head. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement, a concession that spoke volumes, shattering the unspoken pact of refusal that had bound them all. Her nod was not one of defeat, but of genuine, if reluctant, approval, a simple truth her palate could not deny. It was a momentary surrender to a simple, undeniable pleasure, a tiny crack in the rigid wall of wartime animosity. Greta, who had been watching with a mixture of disbelief and growing tension, saw Elsa's nod. Her own cynicism, so fiercely guarded, wavered, then cracked. If Elsa, the stalwart, the unyielding, found something to approve of in this pig food, then perhaps, just perhaps, she shifted her weight, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. a tiny seed of doubt planted in her fortress of conviction. Her initial horror at Elsa's action began to give way to a flicker of curiosity, an internal debate raging behind her narrowed eyes. The scent, now mingled with the tantalizing sounds of Elsa's quiet enjoyment, was a potent adversary to her stubborn pride. Hannah, however, needed no further prompting. The dam of her curiosity burst. Seeing Elsa's quiet transformation, feeling the hunger pangs and smelling the irresistible aroma, she could no longer contain herself. Her eyes, bright with a newfound eagerness, darted towards the serving table. Carter, observing the subtle shifts in the group dynamic, offered her an ear of corn with a reassuring smile. Hannah snatched it, almost hungrily, and took a large, enthusiastic bite. Her eyes instantly lit up, a small gasp of delight escaping her lips, her earlier reticence completely forgotten. It's wonderful," she mumbled, her mouth full, a broad, uninhibited smile spreading across her face, a radiant beam that seemed to banish the shadows from the mess hall. That was all it took. The rigid wall of German defiance crumbled. The other women, witnessing Elsa's quiet pleasure and Hannah's unreserved delight, surged forward. The earlier contempt and suspicion evaporated, replaced by a surge of eager, almost childlike curiosity. A cacophony of murmurs, hushed exclamations of surprise, and the distinct sounds of eager chewing began to fill the mess hall. Each woman, upon taking that first tentative bite, experienced the same shock of sweetness, the same revelation of flavor. The initial silence gave way to a gentle buzz of conversation, punctuated by appreciative hums and sighs of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. They talked amongst themselves in German, their voices rising and falling, a chorus of disbelief and delight. "Unglaublich," one woman exclaimed, eyes wide. "Sus wie Zucker," another agreed, butter already dripping down her chin. Even Greta, after a moment of internal struggle, grudgingly reached for an ear. Her first bite met with an almost imperceptible, involuntary widening of her eyes. She wouldn't admit it aloud, but even her fortified cynicism had been breached by this unexpected assault on her taste buds. The mess hall, moments before a bastion of stoic silence and simmering resentment, now hummed with an unfamiliar energy. The clinking of utensils, the soft murmur of German voices, and the satisfying crunch of corn being devoured replaced the grim quiet. For a brief, precious window, the women were no longer just prisoners, nor were the G.I.s merely their guards. They were simply people, sharing a meal, experiencing a moment of pure, unadulterated pleasure. The sweet, buttery corn offered an undeniable respite from the war, from captivity, from the gnawing fear and uncertainty that had become their constant companions. It was a simple, earthy delight, a taste that transcended language and nationality, speaking directly to a primal human need for comfort and nourishment. It was a taste of summer, of home, of a simple kindness unexpectedly bestowed. Sergeant Carter and his men, observing the remarkable transformation, exchanged pleased smiles. This was more than just feeding prisoners. It was a small, unexpected moment of shared humanity. The cultural barrier, so stark just moments before, had been breached by a simple ear of sweet corn, butter, and salt. It was a small victory, not of arms, but of appetite, a quiet testament to the universal language of good food. Private Miller, who had translated Greta's initial outburst, simply shook his head, a genuine smile replacing his earlier smirk. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Who knew corn could be a peace treaty?" Later that evening, the barracks, usually filled with the low drone of resigned conversation or the tense silence of exhaustion, buzzed with an uncharacteristic animation. Instead of their usual somber discussions about the war's trajectory or their distant homes, the air was filled with animated chatter about the day's unexpected discovery, the Maiskolben. It was a topic of endless fascination, a pleasant distraction from their grim reality. "Can you believe it?" Greta exclaimed, her usual cynicism momentarily eclipsed by genuine wonder. She sat on her cot, cleaning stray kernels from between her teeth with a thoughtful expression. "Sweet, truly sweet like a fruit." Her voice carried a tone of disbelief, as if she were relaying an impossible dream. She was still trying to reconcile this new reality with her deeply ingrained German upbringing. "My father, he would have scoffed," she added, a hint of old defiance returning. But even he might have been surprised. This is an enigma. The idea that something so fundamentally designated for animals could be so palatable, so enjoyable, was a paradigm shift. She found herself describing the sensation to the other women, her hands gesturing, her words unusually enthusiastic. Hannah, still savoring the memory, nodded vigorously. She lay back on her cot, gazing up at the ceiling, a dreamy expression on her face. And so juicy, like nothing I've ever tasted before. Susses das in Stielen wächst, sweets that grow on stalks. She marveled at the concept, the very idea of it, struggling to reconcile this vibrant, delicious reality with their long-held understanding of corn as mere animal feed. How could something so fundamentally wrong in their worldview be so utterly delightful? It was a mystery, a delicious riddle that occupied their weary minds. The simple pleasure of it was almost overwhelming, a stark contrast to the privations they had grown accustomed to. They debated the possible methods of cultivation, the peculiar American soil, anything to explain this anomaly. Perhaps the soil here is different, one woman suggested, or the sun is stronger, another mused. Hannah, however, felt a deeper significance. It was a taste of something genuinely good, unexpected, in a place she had only associated with hardship. The women exchanged glances, a shared understanding blossoming among them. They discussed the taste, the texture, the sensation of the sugar cracking between their teeth. They speculated on how it was grown, how it could be so different from the tough, unpalatable maize their farmers grew for their pigs. It was a conversation rich with discovery, a collective intellectual and sensory adventure that momentarily eclipsed the harsh realities of their confinement. For the first time in a long time, their discussions weren't about the past or the future, but about a joyful present. The mess hall had been more than a mere dining space. It had been a classroom of unexpected culinary revelations. The shared experience had forged a new, albeit subtle bond among them, a collective memory of sweetness amidst the bitter. Elsa, seated on her bunk, watched the younger women, a faint, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips. Her own experience of the corn still lingered, a comforting memory that warmed her from within. She rarely allowed herself such overt displays of emotion, but tonight, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over her. She understood their astonishment, for she had felt it herself. "One can always learn new things," she murmured softly, her voice carrying a quiet wisdom that resonated through the small, crowded space, even in the most unexpected places, and from the most unexpected teachers. Her gaze drifted to the single, bare bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling, then to the barred window, where the vast, star-dusted Kansas sky stretched out, indifferent and immense. The war, she knew, was a monstrous, consuming force, but it had not consumed everything. There were still pockets of simple goodness, even here, in the heart of the enemy's land. The world was still at war, they were still prisoners, but for a moment, the world felt a little less bleak, a little less certain in its harshness. A crack had formed in the solid wall of their assumptions, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate. She considered the G.I.s, the young men who had served them. They were enemies, yes, but they had also offered kindness. The lines, she realized with a growing complexity, were not always as clear as they seemed. This simple act of eating sweet corn, offered and received without malice, began to chip away at their deeply ingrained preconceived notions about America and Americans. It wasn't just fences and guards, the harshness of their capture, or the unending labor. There were also small pleasures, unexpected moments of surprising generosity and novel experiences. The G.I.s, who had been their captors, distant and often faceless embodiments of their defeat, had offered them something delicious and novel, not out of duty or condescension, but out of what seemed to be a genuine, if unstated, desire to share. This seemingly insignificant gesture softened their view, instilling a tiny seed of hope, or, at the very least, a broadened understanding. It suggested that their enemy was not a monolithic entity of pure evil, but comprised of individuals capable of simple kindnesses. That one buttery bite, enhanced by a sprinkling of salt, was more than just food. It symbolized a moment of shared humanity, a subtle shift in perspective that, for a precious few hours, allowed them to glimpse something beyond the immediate pain and prejudice of war. It was a profound lesson, delivered in the simplest of forms, reminding them that even in the darkest of times, unexpected sweetness could bloom. The barbed wire still surrounded them, but for a moment, the emotional barriers had become a little less formidable. The taste had transcended the conflict, creating a brief, ephemeral truce. The memory of that sweet corn, of that unexpected delight in the heart of their captivity, became a small, cherished secret for the women. It was a counter-narrative to the hardships of war, to the grim reality of their imprisonment, a silent, shared understanding that a moment of grace had been granted, a brief window into a world where flavor and pleasure could still exist. They would often speak of it in hushed tones, almost conspiratorially, as a reminder that not all was lost, that even in bleakest circumstances, joy could still find a way to manifest. Eventually the war ended, and the women, along with countless others, were repatriated. They returned to a shattered Germany, to the immense task of rebuilding lives, homes, and a nation scarred by conflict. But that kernel of memory, the startling sweetness of American corn, remained, a tiny golden ember glowing softly in the embers of their past, a beacon of an unexpected, gentle truth. Years turned into decades. The war became history, then memory, then stories passed down through generations. In the bustling post-war kitchens of Germany, where traditional dishes slowly began to reappear, the taste of Maiskolben was a rare and often bewildering topic. Corn, even sweet corn, remained an acquired taste for many Germans, a curiosity rather than a staple. But for the descendants of those women who had been held at Camp Concordia, the story of the pig food became a family legend, a treasured anecdote that highlighted the peculiar ironies and unexpected discoveries of wartime, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. "My grandfather, he was a farmer, you know," remarked a woman in her 60s, sitting in a modern German cafe in Munich, recounting family tales to her wide-eyed granddaughter. "He used to call maize nothing but pig food, said it was coarse, tasteless, fit only for fattening hogs. He'd never dream of putting it on the family table, not for people." She smiled wistfully, a faraway look in her eyes, remembering her own childhood. "But my grandmother, Elsa, she always had a different story, a very particular story. She told me about America, about Camp Concordia, and about the sweet corn. She said it was like magic, a surprise in every bite, something she never forgot. It was her secret joy, a stark contrast to the hardship she endured. Sometimes, even years later, she'd look at a picture of American fields and just smile, a little secret smile, and I knew she was thinking of that corn." Elsa, the Stoic teacher, found a quiet comfort in that memory, a reminder that even in the face of profound loss, new lessons and unexpected joys could be found. She eventually reopened her school, teaching not just arithmetic and grammar, but also a quiet lesson about keeping an open mind, about the capacity for surprise. She never explicitly taught about corn, but the spirit of that unexpected delight informed her philosophy. Another, a man recalling his own grandmother's memories in a television documentary about post-war life, chuckled warmly. In Bavaria, even in the 1950s, people would almost vomit at the thought of eating corn. It just wasn't done. It was Schweinefutter, pure and simple, something alien and crude, not fit for a proper German meal. He paused, his expression softening, a subtle tenderness entering his voice. But for my grandmother, Greta, who was always so stubborn, so fiercely German, so cynical, that corn was, well, it was the first good thing she tasted in America, and she never forgot that. She'd always complain about everything, but when the topic of corn came up, she'd get a faraway look, almost wistful. She never cooked it herself, mind you. She was a traditionalist, but she'd always tell the story with a strange look in her eye, a kind of wonder, a grudging admiration for a country that could make even pig food taste like heaven. It was the only thing American she ever truly praised. Greta, the fiery youth, carried that memory like a strange, valuable scar. Her cynicism remained, but it was tempered by the knowledge that even her most deeply held convictions could be challenged by something as simple as a taste. She became a successful businesswoman, known for her sharp wit and her unexpected moments of quiet, almost vulnerable reflection. and Hannah, who eventually returned to her small village near the Rhine and, to everyone's surprise, fulfilled her childhood dream of becoming a master seamstress, opening a small, beloved shop. She became a beloved storyteller for her grandchildren, her hands always busy with needle and thread. Her voice, usually soft, would gain an almost mystical quality when she spoke of it. It was salty and sweet and warm, she'd whisper, her eyes twinkling. And it made you forget just for a moment the fences and the guards. It made you think perhaps that even in the middle of a war, something good, something truly unexpected and delightful, could come from the other side. That even our enemies had small, delicious secrets to share, if only we were open to them. She would often add, a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. It made me realize that people are not just one thing, not just soldiers or prisoners, but complicated, with many different tastes and kindnesses, even if they are fighting. The world is full of surprises, even in its darkest corners. Hannah, the quiet observer, found a way to weave that lesson into the fabric of her life, embracing new experiences with a gentle curiosity that softened the edges of her wartime trauma. She started incorporating new, vibrant colors into her embroidery, colors she had seen in the vast Kansas landscapes, a subtle tribute to the place that had taught her so much. The legacy of that simple, buttery bite endured, far outlasting the war itself. It was a testament to how profoundly a single, unexpected pleasure could alter perception, how a cultural barrier could dissolve under the simple, universal language of taste. It wasn't about victory or defeat, but about a shared human experience that transcended the brutal divisions of war, a fleeting moment of connection born from the soil of Kansas. In the end, pig food became a symbol, a sweet, salty, and utterly unforgettable taste of unexpected humanity, proving that sometimes, all it takes is one bite to change everything, one momentary connection to remind us of the shared pleasures that bind us, even across the deepest divides of ideology and conflict. It proved that sometimes, the simplest things held the greatest power to surprise, to disarm, and to unite. The echoes of that first bite, the sounds of German women laughing and marveling over a simple ear of corn, rippled through time, a quiet symphony of hope in the vast, complex tapestry of human history. The small pleasures, it turned out, were not just distractions from suffering, but fundamental building blocks of a renewed humanity, capable of bridging chasms of hatred and misunderstanding, one buttered kernel at a time. The GIs who served it had long since returned to their homes, some undoubtedly telling their own stories of the strange German women who called corn pig food, little knowing the profound, quiet revolution they had sparked with their simple golden offering. It was a small golden thread in the vast, messy tapestry of war, but a thread that, for those who experienced it, shone brightly with an enduring sweetness. If you found this journey as compelling as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold stories. Don't forget to hit the like button if this narrative resonated with you, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you.